Welcome once again to the Gaming News Canada Show. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. The hustle and bustle of the spring conference season in the business of betting and gaming comes to a close this week with the Canadian Gaming Summit inside the Metro Toronto Convention Centre. Yours truly will be among the expected 3,000 plus attendees at the annual event organized by SBC. Two of the summit's scheduled 150 speakers join us on today's episode. Amanda Brewer, Canadian Gaming Association Senior Executive and frequent guest of the show, will moderate a panel Wednesday alongside Derek Ramm, Brian Terranova, and Scott Hutchison on the need to modernize Canada's anti-money laundering framework. Craig Cornforth, the Senior Business Development Manager for Epic Global Solutions, will sit down Thursday morning with fellow panelists Jeff Zakodny, Ryan McCarthy, and Alistair Fatiol, with your humble host in the moderator's chair, to talk about regulation and responsibility around player protection. We welcome back to the Gaming News Canada Show after a long hiatus, not imposed by her, I believe, and Amanda Brewer comes back to the show. Hey, Amanda, I'm guilty here. It's been way too long since we had you here on the podcast.
Well, it's funny, Steve, because I listened to your podcast and it doesn't feel like that much time has gone by. So let's just, take that as a compliment to both of us.
Hey, just, I want to talk to you because we are going to push this podcast out on Monday or Tuesday with the start of the Canadian Gaming Summit. And it does, even though, I haven't been to any conferences this year, it still feels a bit of fatigue that the Canadian Gaming Summit is kind of the end of a very busy spring summit season. And I believe you've kind of cut back on your travel schedule too. But is it fair to say that this is kind of the last bit of craziness throughout the industry until things settle down a little bit for July and August?
Yeah, it's traditionally the Canadian Gaming Association, when it was still running the summit, it was usually in the late spring. This is about as late as we'd want to push it, because you give it another 2 weeks and the kids will be out of school and, parents will be starting to take off on summer vacations. So this is the tail end of it before, I guess, SBC Lisbon, goes in September. We've got G2E coming up in October, but it's a bit of a twofold, reason for stepping back from some of the travel, which is, a lot of Canadians have kind of chosen right now to just hit pause on any travel to the US. Also, the dollar is not anyone's friend, but also you're kind of running out of things to talk about a little bit. And I say that with a little bit tongue in cheek, because Ontario is a very stable market at this point in time. We've gotten through the excitement of the launch. We've rung the bell in the third year. Operators coming in, operators leaving. There's not a lot more left to talk about in Ontario. In Alberta, we'll get to that a bit later, but Alberta, we're still waiting. So there's not a lot to talk about yet in Alberta either. So, I've been turning down requests to go speak because it's just, I don't have new information that I think warrants me spending Canadian dollars and, translating them into US dollars and, spending time away, down in the States right now. So that's pretty much the reason for that.
Yeah, it feels like with Alberta right now, it's kind of pushing the peanut up the hill. And, we highlighted in the newsletter last Wednesday, reporting that Jeff Zakodny did on the latest order of council or some kind of motion by the government that kind of, advanced the process a little bit. But it still appears there's a lot of work to be done. And depending who you talk to, Amanda, I mean, and again, I think it takes me back to 3 years ago at ICE, where I think you and I were sitting in the same room, and some guy proclaimed on a panel that the Alberta market was going to open sometime that year, and that was, I think, in February 2023. And I've heard people say it's going to happen before the end of the year. I've heard the first quarter of 2026. I've heard in the first 6 months of 2026. But it does feel to me that there's still, the one question I do have for you is, how many conversations has the province out there had with operators, and do you feel like operators are in a position right now where they would submit an application to do business in Alberta?
It's a yes and a no. You have some that will come in as soon as there's a positive signal that an application will be accepted, and there's others who have very detailed questions that need to be answered before they'll consider it. It depends on the operator, but I think part of the challenge, and this is something that Paul Burns through the Canadian Gaming Association has been advocating for, which is industry consultation. There were the panels down at G2E last year with Minister Nally and his staff, which were great, but there really hasn't been very much since then. And part of the concern with Alberta is, in the absence of industry consultation, are they still taking meetings with individual operators and their lobbyists? And that's where things can kind of get a bit muddled, because now you're advancing operator A, B, C, D, E, F, G's individual interests and agenda for the market, and not necessarily talking to the industry as a whole. So I know that, through Troy Ross and through Paul, and through a lot of the meetings they continue to have out in Alberta, they're really pressing for, as in Ontario, put your draft standards online, give operators 3 weeks or 2 weeks or 10 business days to review and provide comment back. If you're not able to host big roundtables or drop in online meetings, then put things online, give them a way to provide feedback and a deadline, and, handle it that way. So none of that has happened. I know most people who were at the sessions in Las Vegas last October were probably the recipient of an email invitation from the government of Alberta to sign up for alerts. So I've signed up. Nothing has landed in my calendar just yet. But, Minister Nally will be out next week with his staff. And I, like everyone else, will be in attendance in the audience to see what he has to say. We're all here waiting to help. And, the hope still is that they will adopt, 99% of the AGCO's registrar standards that will allow the operators to come in with some level of confidence that they'll know how to operate in that market. And then, whatever they make conduct and manage look like, then, as we've talked ad nauseum before, lots of room for improvement on the conduct and manage side of things. So, we continue to wait, but, just my speculation, I can't see them being in a position to be able to start opening up registration until the fall at the earliest. So that would pretty much point to a market open, if their ducks are in a row, late Q1, Q2 next year.
Hey, we had Troy Roth on the podcast a few weeks ago, and just talking about, there was reporting about some lobbying efforts in British Columbia and Quebec. And again, just you've been around the industry an awful lot longer than I have, but so I wanted your perspective on those kinds of meetings that are taking place, and those efforts to I guess take British Columbia and Quebec and join Ontario and Alberta at some point.
Listen, hope springs eternal. BC, there had been some early outreach, and the reports coming back seemed to signal that the government was receptive. It's kind of comes down to two things: is the government open to regulation, and are they willing to put resources against it? So my understanding is BC had the first, but not necessarily the second. I would give BC a little bit of breathing space, and maybe we circle back to it in the early fall, and see if Sam McLeod has been able to get his legislation finalized and enacted to allow him to stand up his separate agency to be able to kind of create the necessary structure that he would need for this to happen in BC. Quebec, God bless, the association there and their ongoing efforts. If you can hear that, that's Archie, who's on neighborhood watch duty right now. That to me is always going to be a much longer play. And Quebec being Quebec, I could also see them being a province that, kind of publicly is pushing back and digging into its monopoly, while, we're going to wake up one day and all of a sudden they'll announce that they're, launching something. So, Quebec will probably be the province that surprises us, but, also don't hold your breath.
Given the the Donald Trump tariff wars and this push by the new Prime Minister Mark Carney to open the gates to interprovincial cooperation and developing new industries and building a new economy, like is there a place for a more open gaming regime in that plan, Amanda?
if I were to sketch my perfect framework, Canada would have one single set of regulations and one conduct and manage model across all provinces that wanted to participate. Um, I think Alberta will likely you know, set that in motion as much as it can on the standard side of things with the AGCO overseas right now in Ontario. If they largely adopt the AGCO standards, that will make it that much harder for other provinces to want to go and rewrite them. But I think that spirit of reducing red tape, making it easier for interprovincial trade to happen is the right thing. I just think that because gaming has been very entrenched within provincial jurisdictions for so long, and we've got a very vibrant lottery and land-based casino industry across the provinces, that would probably be a harder nut to crack. But certainly, maybe on the online side, when it comes to standards, that may be the one area that would be possible.
I do want to talk about the summit, but before we get to that, just because we're talking about the provinces, there was quite a lot of chatter on social media last Tuesday with the news that FanDuel was going to start imposing a 50-cent surcharge on bets in the Illinois market, and in response to the state's tax rate increasing. I think the tax rate has increased from 15% when the legal market opened there to some 40% now, and there's a lot of conversation around that. And we've known for a while now that states are either talking about it or they've imposed tax hikes on the gaming industry. Is that something that we could see crossing the border? Obviously, we just have Ontario right now, but have there been any discussions about the Ontario government increasing the tax rate on the gaming industry here?
No, and I think that would be a big mistake if they were to look at raising the tax rate. If we've talked about the minimally viable product that continues to exist on the IGO side, and the very painful exercise that all operators just went through with FinTrack. The fact that there's no automation right now for the reporting. So I don't think that there would be, to use the expression, much of a leg to stand on right now to justify increasing the GGR that operators pay back to IGO. I think, back to Illinois, not a state, like I don't operate in the US. But it's a really painful, sort of way to have to operate. And you're really paying for the privilege to be able to offer your product in that state. But I did think it was a bit of a clever way around it, because 50 cents is not necessarily something that someone's going to miss that much.
Right.
And, you have an Uber account in Ontario, you are very accustomed to surcharge pricing hitting you. And, when it's busy or when it's raining and you're really trying to get someplace fast, they have no problem hitting you with the surcharge. But there's very little places now when you actually check out of where you're not being hit with fees being added to the bottom line to cover the operators or the supplier's cost of providing you that service. So I actually thought that was very clever. And I see, states that see our industry as nothing but a piggy bank. You'll see more of that behavior following, because it affects the operator's bottom line, which means they have to cut back on marketing, they have to cut back on employees, they have to cut back on investments to stay in that market, or they have to pass some of those costs along to the customer. So it's a tough line. You can't cross it very often, but I thought that was a good solution, that hopefully customers will not gripe about too much.
I was going to ask you, just does it make it maybe a little bit more attractive for operators to come into Alberta? And I think the consensus has been that Alberta is not going to be quite as robust as Ontario, where we have 50 operators plus OLG. But I just wonder, given the fact that tax rates are rising in U.S. states, trying to get iGaming legalized seems to be a real tough chore right now. That if Alberta does take pretty close to what the Ontario model is right now, if that might be an attractive place for operators who maybe weren't looking at Alberta to come into.
Yeah, I would assume you'll see maybe 80% of the operators that are in Ontario want to enter into Alberta. Alberta will have the same challenge as Ontario of trying to clean up the very well entrenched gray market operators that are have been in their market for a very long time. It's a smaller province. There's a smaller population base. I believe the gambling age Minister Nally announced would be 18, so that's a year younger than in Ontario. A lot of attractive reasons to be in Alberta, but there'll just be less money to spread around amongst the operators. So I think it'll also largely come down to, as we started talking about tax rate, too high a tax rate, operators will not be interested. And also, what the conduct and manage function will be like. If they are going through an audit process that is 99% similar to something Alberta's going to ask for, can they get a buy on it? Can they just get that rubber stamped, or they're going to have to go through a very similar process and spend the money in a second jurisdiction for something that's largely identical to what they've done. So these are some of the, I guess, key questions that started getting raised when Alberta announced it was going to go. And operators are just trying to avoid having to duplicate things that they're doing, kind of 2 provinces away. If the same thing or just about the same thing is going to be asked for, then, again, in the spirit of, reducing red tape, making the compliance not as heavy a list in terms of the cost of it. Can things be shared? Can things be accepted? That kind of thing. So again, we don't have answers to that yet. And I think for some operators, especially the smaller ones, I'm fond of saying the larger operators can afford to throw money at problems where the medium and smaller operators cannot. For those, I think that's what will be weighing their decisions to come into the market, is how expensive it's going to be for them to come in.
Let's get back to the summit, and you're going to be, I don't want to saying about it. We had Derek Ramm on the podcast last week, and Derek talked quite a bit. It was interesting that podcast had stirred a bit of a hornet's nest there, but I think that was because Derek was so open and honest. Yeah, passionate about the state of the anti-money laundering laws in this country. But you are going to host an AML panel on Wednesday morning with Derek, Brian Terranova from FanDuel, and Scott Hutchison from Heinen Hutchison Robitaille LLP, the law firm. Just wondering are there any panels that you're particularly interested in sitting in on, Amanda?
Another one that Scott's on with Danielle Bush from McCarthy Tetro on the Ontario liquidity question. Be interesting to just have them kind of unpack, those couple of days that they spent in court, and if they have any indication of when a verdict may be reached, and what happens if it's not the verdict the industry wants. Paul has one on harmonization. We've got Darren Dorsey coming up from AGEM. He's the president of AGEM. So in the spirit of trying to make things easier for the industry across provinces, the fireside chats between Dave Forrestal and Doug Downey, and then Heidi Reinhardt and Stan Cho. There's, I think, going to be some really great, smart panels there. And then in between that, really looking forward to having lots of people coming in from out of town and seeing some familiar faces and meeting some people for the first time face to face. So yeah, I always look forward to the summit. It's a good time. So fingers are firmly crossed for good weather.
Yeah, well, trying to get anybody from the AGCO or the Alberta government on the podcast has been about
you're gonna have to ambush them next week.
Yeah, it's been about as successful as the Maple Leafs getting past the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. But we will try again next week. But you're right; it's great to get FaceTime from those people, to hear from those people. And it's funny though. Last year and again this year, some of the dynamics are interesting around the summit. I mean, the provincial lottery and gaming corporations are going to have a very visible presence again, and we know that that there's some tension between operators and the provincial lottery and gaming corps, and again the suppliers. And the one thing I would say, again, we've talked in this program, Amanda, you and I, many times over the last 4 years about mainstream media coverage of the industry, and And we can always nitpick about the agenda and say, geez, we wish there was a panel on this, or why are they doing that panel. But I do think if you're someone who wants to cover this industry or is covering this industry, it really is worth your while to spend the 2 days and walk around and sit in on some of those conversations that take place on the stages.
Listen, this is the only conference for the Canadian gaming industry. There'll be panels at other conferences here and there, but it's always interesting. Paul was down speaking at one in Fort Lauderdale, and he was the only Canadian on the panel about Canada. So it's just, you can't underestimate how important it is to have this industry come together and talk about the issues that are unique to us here. They're going to be different than what our industry south of the border overseas are dealing with. So we have a unique makeup in terms of our crown corporations and our lottery corporations. We've got emerging markets. Alberta as a next multi-product market, that's going to be huge in North America, absolutely huge. So I think for us to have something that's for ourselves, by ourselves, and for ourselves, that's really, really important.
Hey, before we let you go, Amanda, it's been almost.
Yes, the Oilers are going to win the Stanley Cup. I know
okay.
That's yes.
Yes. Well, if that happens, I'm sure that'll take up that'll give Dale Nally something to talk about loud and clear. I think when he speaks next Wednesday. I do want to ask you. It's been almost a year now since Martha Otten announced that she'd be stepping down as executive director of iGaming Ontario, and it appears, unless something changes between the time we're recording this interview on Wednesday, June 11th, and the summit next week, that iGaming Ontario won't have a new senior executive in place next week. Hopefully I'm not putting you in a spot here, but I mean, it certainly is curious, to say the very least, that a successor hasn't been named almost 12 months later.
Well, yes. I don't want to say, well, that's just government. They work, at their own pace in their own way. I have a lot of good friends, and I know a lot of good people who work at iGaming Ontario. I honestly don't know what's going on with the search for Martha's replacement. I know in talking to a lot of people in the industry, and, again, if you talk to people like Troy Ross, really hoping that it's someone with some commercial acumen that gets the nod, that has, spent a bit of time, working as an operator, who can understand what it is, the operator's experience. But, the transition to Minister Cho's office is about a month old,
right?
Heading into summer. So I don't know. This could be something that only gets picked up again in the fall. We're all waiting, the same as you are, Steve, just to see what, kind of direction the board decides they need to move in with the new CEO.
Do you think not having a replacement in place has had an impact on things like, Derek Ramm talked about, and you mentioned it too, the kind of challenges right now with reporting on the AML side, and again, I think it was last August that IGO announced that Eyes Up and IC360 was going to deliver a self-exclusion program, and that hasn't been launched yet. I just wonder how much has that void in leadership impacted issues like that.
Listen, I don't know if it's so much a void in leadership as it is a culture that just doesn't communicate. And I learned that the hard way when I was working at the CBC, another Crown corporation. And in the absence of official communication coming from, leadership or the organization, everyone else will fill in that void with their version of what they think is going on. And so I think it's, certainly something you've been frustrated by, but it's just, I think, a cultural mindset where, communicating with the industry, communicating with stakeholders hasn't really been something that they've embraced from launch. Again, with the new CEO coming in, maybe it's somebody who will be able to influence that a little bit more. But, it's not rocket science that you've announced something which is project based, and you've announced a vendor, and you put timelines in place, and you provide updates against those timelines. In my mind, that's not rocket science, but it just hasn't happened. I don't know why. All I can point to is perhaps, that's just not the way they kind of organize themselves from the get-go, and it's just not something they've embraced as the years have gone by.
That's Amanda Brewer, Senior Executive with the Canadian Gaming Association. Amanda, it's going to be great to see you in person on Tuesday night at the CGA reception, and to hopefully spend a bit of time with you at the summit this week. But always enjoy having you on, and we will try not to bug you over the summer. And
bug away! I'm here.
Well, me too. So I may I take that back. I will be bugging you over the summer because I think you're right. I think it is going to be as you put it, the kids are going to be out of school and things will be a little bit quieter. Though one thing I've kind of seen with this industry is there's always something happening, even in the the so-called soft months. So I expect we'll have a topic or two to discuss over the summer.
Sounds good. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Amanda. We welcome to the podcast the Senior Business Development Manager for Epic Global Solutions, Craig Cornforth. Craig joins us from St. Julian's, where he's attending the SBC Summit Malta. And I'll just mention that, Craig, off the top, we recorded this interview a week ago. So anyway, listen, welcome to the podcast.
Great to see you again, Steve. Thanks for having me.
And listen, I'm really excited to be getting together with you next week in person, along with Alistair Fatch. Sorry, not next week, but on Thursday. This podcast is coming out at the start of the week, just before the Canadian Gaming Summit. You, Alistair Fatchiol from Rhino Entertainment, and Ryan McCarthy from the British Columbia Lottery Corporation are going to join me for a panel Thursday morning on regulation and responsibility in the Canadian gaming industry. We're going to try our best to steer clear of the conversation we're going to have then and focus today on your story and the work that Epic is doing. Hey, I want to start, Craig. How does someone who was working in the insurance and automobile sales piece of those businesses less than a decade ago end up a little more than 4 years ago making a commitment to helping people who struggle with their gambling habits?
Yeah, even as you say the numbers, Steve, it sometimes still feels almost unbelievable. It certainly wasn't planned. It certainly wasn't something, had you spoken to me, as you say, a decade ago, 10 years ago, I'd have been, as much as it pains me to say, approaching me late 40s or mid 40s rather, and really happy. I think I've been in the, as you say, in the automobile industry almost all of my life as a car dealer. Really successful, enjoyed it, loved working with people. And I would think, to be absolutely truthful, and you will get that from me as someone who lives in recovery, it's one of the foundations that's built on really is that it was, I wouldn't go as far as to say I was pushed into this area, but it was because of such an enormous change in my life. I did develop a gambling addiction over probably a period of a number of years. I've always been very competitive, loved sport. I think that's enabled me to be successful commercially in everything that I've done, to have that drive, to have, I know we spoke off camera about the jerseys I can see in your background there. So competitiveness, risk perhaps, enjoying taking a chance, almost exacerbated my addiction once I walked down that road, if you like. It became the only thing that it almost engulfed me, really. I think the only thing that I thought that was helping me was the thing, what it was almost destroying me, really. And I came across, I was so lucky in my very early recovery to have a very strong network. We'll perhaps touch on it in a bit, but I'm not a particularly religious or spiritual person, I don't think, but this is what the sort of second half, let's hope the second, middle third of my life perhaps has been enormously fulfilling for me to do, as you say, by using mine and my colleagues' lived experience of very, very dark times of my life. I'm enormously proud to work in this industry. It's one that I've taken part of as a customer for a long time. And I'd like to think I've had a little bit of effectiveness in changing it in the last sort of into my fourth year now working for Epic. So good fortune, I suppose, taking a positive from a really dark situation, I think.
Hey, Craig, because of your story, I just, it's an important one to tell. And I just have a couple of questions. The first one is just how much do you think your addiction was driven by that competitive nature and wanting to show that you were smarter than everybody else? And then I wonder how much of it was driven by the allure of being able to make, what I think a lot of addicts would consider to be easy money. If I'm a smart guy on football, I can make 500 euros today or whatever, and I'm going to be able to buy myself a new car or put a new kitchen in the house for my wife.
Yeah, great questions, both of them, and I'll address them as they feel to me, and they're almost like two different parts of my life. I think them really. If I can turn them around the other way,
sure.
I started gambling at a very young age, and whether that was playing cards with. I'm one of 5 boys, so I've got 4 brothers, all very competitive when we were growing up, all very sport focused. My brother was an ex-professional footballer, played international football. We all played to a reasonable standard, UK football, proper real football, not the North American version. And I think this sort of leads into the answer to your first question, if you like, that I never really gambled. It sounds crazy to say this, but I didn't gamble to make lots of money, to build a kitchen, I did it because it was fun, so it enhanced the sport, in my instance, usually and almost predominantly soccer, football. And in friendship groups, it would be, I would enjoy playing cards. I would go, so look, I'm 53. I've seen the change of it in the UK from when it was a bookmaker, which was almost seen as a place where only certain people went, that were hidden away on high streets, that, you opened the door. I mean, believe it or not, this will be going internationally. When I was growing up and in my late teens to first starting to gamble, if you like, in the sort of late 80s, you couldn't even see in a bookmaker's window. They were covered out. It was a hidden place. You opened the door and people were smoking and smoke would come out. It was almost a mythical place. But as it changed and became more entertainment focused, I've seen that right the way through up to the massive venues that are there. So I enjoyed it. Look, it was my leisure and entertainment, as I believe it is for the majority of people who use it today. Huge majority of people who use it today. It's fun, right? It only really became, as you very, pertinently described it, in 2 ways. Something to, did it make me worse or better, however you look at it, because I thought I was better than it? Without a doubt, and 100%, my drive in every area of my life made me a terrible bad gambler, if that makes sense. It was never really the chasing the financial reward, when most people would find that bizarre, because in my instance, and a huge number of people I work with in the industry from lived experience, and certainly the 25 or so colleagues I've got who work with me on both sides of the Atlantic in Epic, when we discuss it, when we get together, it can become quite dark quite quickly, because it's that competitive nature runs through us all, male or female, demographic, age group, whatever background. But it absolutely then made me almost feel as though it would be losing by admitting that I had a problem. It's quite difficult to describe, really, but it's certainly a theme that I've seen in recovery rooms, whether that's in GA rooms, and I've been in many over the world. But that is a theme that I've seen that runs through, that almost once it gets too late for us, that fire is difficult to put out. It's why the work we do at Epic and with all of the operators and where we work all around the world is about education and about prevention and trying to get there a bit earlier. Because the point I make, Stephen, I'm not ashamed to say it. If anything, I'm proud to say it, is I miss it. It was, had I been, I don't blame gambling or the gambling industry. It was my misuse of the products to cover probably trauma in an earlier part, and without getting into the psychological side of it. But I firmly believe that if the market was as it is today, and the work we and the guys you've mentioned and everyone else who will see it at the summit over the next few days, both in Malta and Canada, it didn't need to get as bad as it did for me or many others,
What changed, Craig? I mean, you're obviously in a good place today, but was there one moment, or was there a person? Like what was it that got your life turned around and got it going in the right direction?
I got caught, is the truth. It wasn't if I hadn't have done, and I was, without going into the forensic of it, I was sort of senior management, sort of C-suite level of a really successful prestige car dealership, which I'd helped build from the ground up, basically. Loved the job, loved the work, was very successful at it. But once I had developed the gambling addiction that I did, starting to use markets that I had no interest in. More importantly, never mind no knowledge of. I think it's an important part, and it's certainly something we address in almost all of our training that we do at Epic. Is that I would have still been doing it today had I not been caught. And the truth of that is I probably would have been in jail and maybe been in jail and out again. So I was caught because although I earned 6 figures and above and was very well looked after by the company I worked for, who was also a very close friend, sadly, I ended up embezzling and stealing money from there to feed my addiction. Ended up, as is quite often the case, and with respect to everyone who does share the story and who goes through, it may come across like it's an easy thing to do, but no time's easy, because we remember the people we've hurt, not just our loved ones, colleagues, employees, the people that we haven't, that we failed essentially. And that's the thing that I struggled with very early on, was to accept that it was because it was something that I used to enjoy doing and had such fond memories of over the years, that I'd manipulated to the point where I had to steal to be able to carry on doing it. So the truthful is that it wasn't. It's one of my weaknesses, I think, now, is that I accept that it's now just over 7 years. October the 7th, 2017 was my last bet. Sometimes it feels like 3 weeks ago, depending on the frame of mind, and I have the odd dream, etc. But it certainly empowers me and makes me passionate about what I do today, because it's the whole, if you like, it's almost like a little bit of penance, that you feel that the other people that I've harmed, they never had any choice in this matter, and I include people who work for the operators, employees, staff members, family members, ex-partner, etc. So I can't really, if the truth be told, take a huge amount of credit for it. But other than I live every day to make sure that I don't go to that place again,
I want to talk to you about Epic, Craig, and the story of the company you're working for now. We deal a lot with responsible gambling on this podcast. I mean, we talk to operators, we talk to regulators, we talk to the provincial lottery and gaming corporations. We talk to organizations like yours and the Responsible Gambling Council. Can you just tell our audience kind of where Epic fits into that responsible gambling space?
Of course. I mean, all of the names you mentioned, I'm proud and privileged to have worked with. I'm a huge believer that almost leave competition to people who want it to be a competition. I almost feel everyone you've spoken to, I've either been on a panel for, I've been and spoke to, I've spent quite a number of visits to Canada over the last couple of years, working primarily with OLG, but also with RGC, and speaking at at internal and external events. But Epic so we're in our 11th year now, and we were founded by Paul Buck, who's our CEO and founder, who, I'm sure a lot of people who are interested in this podcast is likely to have heard of before. And our space is, if not, I urge you to have a look online. There's a lot of our stuff on our YouTube channel, and it's only a click away to understand exactly Epic's journey in the last just over 10 years. But our place in the ecosystem, I think, is one of prevention. It's not a glib comment. It's something that I think there's 53 of us now. I think I was number 17 when I joined. So our growth has been enormous in terms of the industry, if you like, the lived experience side. But it also has been prohibited a bit by our role isn't exactly something that you can just advertise to say, have you lived through gambling? How have you? And the important thing also, are you wanting to try and make it better? That includes for us as lived experience as well as the industry. And it's important for us to make sure that point comes across. Is none of us at Epic are anti-gambling at all. We don't blame them for that. So our place is through consultancy, through training from our RG teams. We have worked in, at last count, 35 countries over 6 continents. We have a line that almost runs through everything that we do, and it's learning from lived experience. That people are at the heart of everything that we do, and it's we're privileged to do what we do. We understand that not everyone gets it. I think sometimes mine and the team I've worked for, we spend a lot of time in different countries and trying to explain to cab drivers or people waiting in hotel bars or airports that we've all lived through very dark times through our addictions and subsequent recovery. And then we're going to work with the people who, when people don't quite understand it, they think, they'll often say, well, you're going to work with the people who caused this problem. That's not, that absolutely isn't the way that we look at it. It's, everybody looking in the same direction, working towards it, means that my stepson, who's just turned 14, when he's in 4 years' time, when he's old enough to gamble in the UK, I want that market to be as safe as it can be for somebody who should be able to enjoy something that I can no longer do.
Craig, I'm just going to go off the beaten path for a second there. You mentioned your 14-year-old son, and recently I was helping out at a hockey camp where I live, and there was a father and son in the dressing room, and the son was same age as your son, 14 years old, and he was talking about the bets he had made that night, and then he was going to a friend's house after this hockey camp to play poker with a bunch of friends, and it was a bit of a it concerned me a little bit. And again, I think one of the misconceptions out there about the legal gaming industry is that a 14-year-old is allowed to legally set up a sportsbook account, and there are mechanisms in place. And I think a big part of what organizations like Epic, if they're not doing it, I'm sure they are, but can do, is the importance of educating parents. And this is something I spoke with Shelley White from the Responsible Gambling Council about and spoken others as well. But there is an onus on parents to understand, just like we educate our children about smoking cigarettes or about using drugs or drinking alcohol. But what would your message be to those parents who think maybe it's okay to help set up their 14-year-old son with a sports book account and allow them to bet?
Thank you for mentioning it, Steve. It's one that I sometimes not try to crowbar in because of my own circumstances, but it's one that's absolutely dear to the heart to Epic, and as it should be for every parent, every uncle, every aunt, whoever it may be. I think it's twofold. Is that it's enormous, the issue. I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak as frank as you did there, to be honest, about hearing that from a 14-year-old, and it sends shivers down my spine a little bit. In terms of my instant sort of reaction and instant feeling, there's probably not a more educated 14-year-old kid on earth than my lad, because he knows my stories. My stepson, he's been in my life 7 years, changed my life. I love him to bits, and he knows my entire story. And again, I've never told him to scare him or to put him off things, but look, I don't think there's a kid around that isn't already gambling in some way, whether it's on Roblox, whether it's on Fortnite, whether it's on FIFA packs. And my feeling on it, and I can only speak from my personal perspective, is that as long as they're educated more, as long as it's not that hidden story like the uncle that used to drink too much that we don't speak about at Christmas, this is the key that we've got to be able to get and change the next generation of it. So I don't want it to be banned for my boy. I want it to be safe and to be better and more fun and to be done. Because look, the scariest thing for me in my early recovery was to try and come to terms with that and never do again the thing that I loved for 25 years. There's no need for it to be that far. So you're right, we do it at Epic. We spoke to at last count, and again, it's off the top of my head, but certainly more than 55,000 students over the last 6, 7, 8 years in the UK. The truth of that is that it's difficult to get it funded. We've self-funded it at times. We've had the industry have funded it, but because the UK market at times has as many people saying what a terrible place it has become as it is to us who are trying to make it better, it can become increasingly difficult to get particularly large tier 1 operators and brands to be aligned with that. We've had some brilliant support, including from North America, over the last few years. And without it becoming like an advert, we're always looking for the next one, because it's not only are they helping and protecting the child of today and tomorrow. Look, I've been a car dealer all my life. They're also looking after the next customer of tomorrow. And I think the closer we can get those two together, the commercial teams and the safer gambling, the RG teams, they'll never be completely side by side. And I get that, right? I've sort of come to the other side to try and get the doors open for more of teams like ours and like RGCs and like everybody else who we speak about, is that we need people to understand that it's okay to be profitable. It's okay to make money. It's okay for my mother still to be able to go and play bingo, because that shouldn't be stopped because I spoiled it. So we just need to come closer together. You've nailed it, I think, with education. And I'm a really positive guy now. I've had enough of the half empty time of my life. That was done, for those the year or so when I didn't work and I lost my home and had an attempt on my own life and had to live in my parents' house at 47 years old with nothing, let's be a bit more positive and be a bit prouder of what we do, I think. And it's, there is great things being done. We'll discuss it on our panel in, next week. And certainly I feel it's positive. I see it's only been, I'm in my 4th year of being in this industry in a totally different aspect to where I was previously. And can it be better? Of course it can. Everything can. But I believe we are going in the right direction. And, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. The idea of being financially successful as well as being responsible,
Hey, Craig, you mentioned OLG, and I've been covering this industry for about the same amount of time that you've been in the industry. And, everything I've been told is that Canada has a very good reputation when it comes to responsible gambling. The Game Sense initiative from the BCLC is something that's been marketed to the U.S. BCLC has a relationship with MGM Resorts.
Yep.
The Responsible Gambling Council and OLG have a partnership around the Play. I believe it's the Play Smart programs and Play Mart centers at casinos across Ontario. Can you tell me just a little bit about the kind of work that Epic has been doing with OLG?
Of course, I'd be delighted to. It's I'm really proud of the fact that I've been there basically since ground zero, sort of up over. It's been both empowering, I think, for not just professionally, but as I almost sometimes forget that I'm a gambling addict in recovery because I spent so much time talking about it. But the likes of the Play Smart, the likes of, as you say, RGC, I won't name check anyone because hopefully they'll all know how much they mean to us. But it's been really refreshing, almost to the point where the appetite seems to be growing to learn more from essentially a market that has been forced down a route of regulation that I think perhaps that I wouldn't be quite as keen a customer in if I was 18, if I was my boy in 4 years' time. When you look, and for those who are listening from the North American market who don't quite understand what I mean by that, the affordability and the ID checks, etc., which have been pushed into the UK market because of people like me being able to sort of manipulate it and take it too far. I sincerely hope, and I genuinely believe, based on my last 2 and a bit years' work with OLG, is that they are realizing that gap that I mentioned a little bit before between financial stability and success and responsible. To me, Steve, it really just comes down to better customer service. I never thought that I would have seen the day in such a short period of time that when I was speaking at the Rama event for OLG, and I seen the Play Smart area in that casino there. I know they were the first to ever do that sort of thing. It scared me a little bit, if I'm honest, but that's only because I was remembering as my time as somebody who had a problem with gambling.
Right.
I stood there and watched customers go in and chat and have cups of coffee because it's normal, right? Once things start to become normal and you just think, well, this is better customer service than what I'm used to, less of people like me will exist. You can't write it out and you can't stop it completely because we're dealing with humans, adult humans who make bad decisions, and we do that. I shouldn't talk about odds as someone in recovery, but it's probably not the last bad decision I'll ever make in my life. But it's I just think the fact that we're working closely together, it's distance is the only sort of holding back for us in terms of Epic. But we do a lot by teams. We've had a team just out there delivering face to face, and we do customer interaction training. We do every time we're there. We leave with as many ideas for the next time that we go than when we've been there before. But it's always focused from a lived experience perspective, but one from a very warm, caring place that we want to try and mitigate the amount of people like our teams. As an example, for the first time we've got a new member of our team, Megan Vanderson, who changes the demographic from what we can deliver at Epic. She's 24 years old. The only, I don't want to say negative, but what seems to be a fairly constant theme in the lived experience world, particularly in the training side, is that they tend to look a bit like me. It tends to be a white middle-aged man who comes and talks about the problems that they've had. We need to change that. We're doing it at Epic already. We've got further hires to come. So it's really exciting. I think that the Canadian market is one that rightly should be proud of itself. Interesting to see how Alberta goes. It seems to be that they rather than it be looking over the fence at their neighbour and saying, we're not going to do it how they've done, my feeling, and you can tell me better, and I'm sure I'll hear more from it next week at SBC, is that they're taking the best bits and then trying to refine it, which in any business is the right way to go, right?
Yeah, I think Alberta, and we'll get into this more on our panel Thursday morning, is Alberta has the advantage of taking the lessons learned from Ontario 3 years into the open market there, and kind of, making those tweaks to the market when they open in 2026. Hey, Craig, just want to run a couple more things by you. You mentioned partnerships, and Epic Global Solutions just announced one the last couple of weeks with Amanda, and we'll make sure we'll include a link to the press release of that announcement in the Substack post that goes out with the podcast. But I just wonder how this partnership kind of complements each other, because it does seem there's a little bit of crossover between both companies.
I think so. And I mean, it almost feels as though we've got the same heartbeat without sounding too cliched. It is done from a position of care, one of the client and the staff being almost like the blood that runs through it. It's really easy in this space, in the lived experience space, to feel almost as though everyone should feel sorry for you. And I don't mean that, to sound glib about it. My feeling and Epic's feeling, and certainly all of the teams that I'm so proud to work with, is that we don't want to just be going into a room and leaving applause behind at times, or even leaving a sad feeling behind. We must leave a deeper footprint than that. It has to be something that when people have been there, they don't just remember our sessions because of the darkness or the recovery story from it. Because I think it's fair to say you'd have to be quite a dark-souled person to not take something from that. But we also have to change the minds and the thoughts for the next time they speak to someone in 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years. That's the feeling we got with the matter, is that we've seen they've got some really powerful videos and some really powerful testimonials in there. So it just feels almost as though everything that we do and every new partnership that we are, that we're proud to join, it's like another bit of the jigsaw gets filled. I'm not saying that it's missing or anyone's better than others, but nobody knows the whole story. But there's been huge progress. If you look at, there's an announcement, that we've just made for the summit in Calgary that Dan Spencer, my colleague's been asked to speak at. If you'd said that, I think 4 or 5 years ago, that the following few days the world leaders are going to be there, and we've got a panel talking about responsible gaming and safer gambling, that's got to be looked at as huge stride, surely. So it's anyone listening, anyone wants to reach out, the information at the end, we're always happy to listen and happy to chat.
Hey, Craig, last question, and I hope I'm not throwing you a curveball here, but part of Epic's business is educating athletes, and it's something, again, that I think certainly people like me who are, sports fans, follow sports closely as I have for most of my career as a sports journalist, and just the importance of educating athletes. We had the newsletter a couple of weeks ago. Anthony Milton did a pretty enlightening article for Toronto Life magazine on Jonte Porter, the former Toronto Raptors player who was involved in a match manipulation scandal last season, and just how important it is to educate athletes. And you and I are having this conversation. We have a Winter Olympics taking place in 2026. Of course, the FIFA World Cup's coming to Canada, the United States, and Mexico next summer. And so this is an ongoing conversation, and we know the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports is working with the Canadian Olympic Committee to make sure that they're educating athletes on match manipulation. But maybe just talk for a minute or so as we wrap up this interview just on the work that Epic's doing in that area.
Of course, you'll have to wave the hand when a minute goes, Steve, because I could talk about hours on this. So it's never been more important is the absolute answer to that. If I can share just briefly, we spoke before this, and we're both sports nuts. It's, I'm from a family of people who played to a reasonable level. My brother was a professional footballer, played internationally for Wales. And I've shared this with him, and he shared things with me. It's 30 years, certainly 25 years since he played at any sort of level. And then it was about playing cards on the bus. It was gambling. Everybody gambled. It was just part of the thing. And whilst there's been great strides in most areas in sports, certainly when you look at sports science, the investment, the money that's been made, and this is global I'm talking about here, my genuine feeling and my experiences from it is that there hasn't been a great amount of stride in looking after the product, which is the player. So that's what we do, and we've got an incredible partnership with the NCAA that we deliver all around the US in colleges in Canada, which is I spent some time with the team in Dallas at the back end of last year, and it was staggering to see the progress I think that the US have made in that respect in terms of other countries. We work, without just listing off who we do work with loads amounts of professional sport in the UK, both men and women. And the numbers are that professional athletes are in the region of 6 or 7 times more likely to develop gambling addiction or other addictions than the general Joe public, if you like. And it almost feels like the circle of life. When we first started about this interview and my conversation this morning, because of the reason behind that is, the main reasons are the likes of competitiveness, don't like losing face, you get taught to win, second's no good. And I believe, without turning into a speech about it, is that the world needs a bit, is turning that way. When you see parents, when young kids are playing sport, they're almost looking like it's their ticket out of wherever they are. So it's hugely important. We do it. We've got a number of ex-professional athletes and current professional athletes who have lived experience from gambling addiction, and from the NBA. Steven Smith, who's a superb speaker and a great a colleague of ours. But it's vitally important. And it's about learning from yesterday, isn't it? So it's I think in every area that we do at Epic it's not we do it for people either to congratulate or to chastise, which sometimes happens. We do it to try and make it better for the player, the person, the athlete, the student tomorrow.
Craig Cornforth is the Senior Business Development Manager for Epic Global Solutions. Hey, Craig, I really appreciate you joining me from Malta. And as I said at the top, I'm really excited to meet you in person on Wednesday or certainly Thursday morning when our panel takes place. But listen, enjoy the time in Malta, and look forward to seeing you in Toronto.
Likewise. Thanks, Steve.
That's it for another episode of the Gaming News Canada show. You can find us at gamingnewscanada.ca and also on the various podcast platforms. And you can also watch this show on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Thanks so much to Amanda Brewer and Craig Cornforth for being our guests on this episode. And we do look forward to seeing everybody this week at the Canadian Gaming Summit.